Hello there. I'm your imaginary friend. Now, if you're amenable, I would like to continue reading Arthur Machen's The Terror. Now, if this is news to you and you haven't heard the first reading, it's a good place to start. Um, this is part 12, The Letter of Wrath. It was a still September afternoon. No wind stirred in the hanging woods that were dark all about the ancient house of Treff Loyne. The only sound in the dim air was the lowing of the cattle. They'd wandered, it seemed, from the fields and had come in by the gate of the farmyard, and stood there melancholy as if they mourned for their dead master. And the horses, four great, heavy, patient-looking beasts, they were there too. And in the lower field the sheep were standing, as if they wanted to be fed. You would think they all knew there was something wrong, one of the soldiers muttered to another. The pale sun showed for a moment and glittered on their bayonets. They were standing about the body of poor dead Griffith, with a certain grimness growing on their faces and hardening there. Their corporal snapped something at them again. They were quite ready. Lewis knelt down by the dead man and looked closely at the great gaping wound in his side. "He's been dead a long time," he said. "A week, 2 weeks, perhaps. He was killed by some sort of sharp-pointed weapon. How about the family? How many are there of them? I never attended them." "There was Griffith and his wife and his son Thomas and Mary Griffith, his daughter, and I do think there was a gentleman lodging with them this summer." That was from one of the farmers. They all looked at one another, this party of rescue, who knew nothing of the danger that had smitten this house of quiet people, nothing of the peril which had brought them to this pass of a farmyard with a dead man in it, and his beasts standing patiently about him as if they waited for the farmer to rise up and give them their food. Then the party turned to the house. It was an old 16th century building with the singular round Flemish chimney that is characteristic of Myrion. The walls were snowy with whitewash, the windows were deeply set and stone mullioned, with a solid stone-tiled porch sheltered the doorway from any winds that might penetrate to the hollow of the hidden valley. The windows were shut tight. There was no sign of any life or movement about the place. The party of men looked at one another, and the churchwarden amongst the farmers, the sergeant of police, Lewis, and the corporal drew together. "What is it to goodness, doctor?" said the churchwarden. "I can tell you nothing at all, except that that poor man there has been pierced to the heart," said Lewis. "Do you think they're inside, and they will shoot at us?" said another farmer. He had no notion of what he meant by they, and no one of them knew better than he. They did not know what the danger was, or where it might strike them, or whether it was from without or from within. They stared at the murdered man and gazed dismally at one another. "Come," said Lewis, "we must do something. We must get into the house and see what is wrong." "Yes, but suppose they are at us while we are getting in," said the sergeant. "Where shall we be then, Dr. Lewis?" The corporal put one of his men by the gate at the top of the farmyard, another at the gate by the bottom of the farmyard, and told them to challenge and shoot. The doctor and the rest opened the little gate of the front garden and went up to the porch and stood listening by the door. It was all silence, all dead silence. Lewis took an ash stick from one of the farmers and beat heavily 3 times on the old black oaken door studded with antique nails. He struck 3 thundering blows, and they all waited. There was no answer from within. He beat again, and still silence. He shouted to the people within, but there was no answer. They all turned and looked at one another. That party of quest and rescue, who knew not what they sought, what enemy they were to encounter. There was an iron ring on the door. Lewis turned it, but the door stood fast. It was evidently barred and bolted. The sergeant of police called out to open, but again there was no answer. They consulted together. There was nothing for it but to blow the door open. and some one of them called in a loud voice to anybody that might be within to stand away from the door or they would be killed. And at this very moment, the yellow sheepdog came bounding up the yard from the woods and licked their hands and fawned on them and barked joyfully. Indeed, now, said one of the farmers, he did know that there was something amiss. Pity it was, Thomas Williams, that we did not follow him when he implored us last Sunday. The corporal motioned the rest of the party back, and they stood looking fearfully about them at the entrance to the porch. The corporal disengaged his bayonet and shot into the keyhole, calling out once more before he fired. He shot and shot again. So heavy and firm was the ancient door, so stout its bolts and fastenings. At last he had to fire at the massive hinges, and then they all pushed together, and the door lurched open and fell forward. The corporal raised his left hand and stepped back a few paces. He hailed his 2 men at the top and bottom of the farm. They were all right, they said. And so the party climbed and struggled over the fallen door into the passage and into the kitchen of the farmhouse. Young Griffith was lying dead before the hearth, before a dead fire of white wood ashes. They went on towards the parlor, and in the doorway of the room was the body of the artist, Secretan, as if he had fallen in trying to get to the kitchen. Upstairs, the 2 women, Mrs. Griffith and her daughter, a girl of 18, were lying together on the bed in the big bedroom, clasped in each other's arms. They went about the house, searched the pantries, the back kitchen, and the cellars. There was no life in it. "Look," said Dr. Lewis when they came back to the big kitchen. "Look, it is as if they'd been besieged. Do you see that piece of bacon, half gnawed through?" Then they found these pieces of bacon cut from the sides on the kitchen wall, here and there about the house. There was no bread in the place, no milk, no water. "And," said one of the farmers, "they had the best water here in all Myrion. The well is down there in the wood, is most famous water. The old people did use to call it Flunon Tylo. It was St. Tylo's well, they did say." "They must have died of thirst," said Lewis. "They've been dead for days and days." The group of men stood in the big kitchen and stared at one another, a dreadful perplexity in their eyes. The dead were all about them, within the house and without it, and it was in vain to ask why they had died thus. The old man had been killed with a piercing thrust of some sharp weapon. The rest had perished, it seemed probable, of thirst. But what possible enemy was this that besieged the farm and shut in its inhabitants? There was no answer. The sergeant of police spoke of getting a cart and taking the bodies into Porth, and Dr. Lewis went into the parlor that Secretan had used as a sitting room, intending to gather any possessions or effects of the dead artist that he might find there. 6 portfolios were piled up in one corner. There were some books on a side table, a fishing rod and basket behind the door. That seemed all. No doubt there would be clothes and such matters upstairs, and Lewis was about to rejoin the rest of the party in the kitchen, when he looked down at some scattered papers lying with the books on the side table. On one of the sheets, he read to his astonishment the words, "Dr. James Lewis, Porth." This was written in a staggering, trembling scrawl, and examining the other leaves, he saw that they were covered with writing. The table stood in a dark corner of the room, and Lewis gathered up the sheets of paper and took them to the window ledge, and began to read, amazed at certain phrases that had caught his eye. But the manuscript was in disorder, as if the dead man who had written it had not been equal to the task of gathering the leaves into their proper sequence. It was some time before the doctor had each page in its place. This was the statement that he read, with ever-growing wonder, while a couple of the farmers were harnessing one of the horses in the yard to a cart, and the others were bringing down the dead women. "I do not think that I can last much longer. We shared out the last drops of water a long time ago. I do not know how many days ago. We fall asleep and dream and walk about the house in our dreams, and I am often not sure whether I am awake or still dreaming, and so the days and nights are confused in my mind. I awoke not long in the passage. I had a confused feeling that I had had an awful dream which seemed horribly real, and I thought for a moment what a relief it was to know that it wasn't true, whatever it might have been. I made up my mind to have a good long walk to freshen myself up, and then I looked round and found that I'd been lying on the stones of the passage, and it all came back to me. There was no walk for me. I have not seen Mrs. Griffith or her daughter for a long while. They said they were going upstairs to have a rest. I heard them moving about the room at first. Now I can hear nothing. Young Griffith is lying in the kitchen before the hearth. He was talking to himself about the harvest and the weather when I last went into the kitchen. He didn't seem to know I was there. And he went gabbling on in a low voice, very fast. And then he began to call the dog, Tiger. There seems no hope for any of us. We're in the dream of death. Here the manuscript became unintelligible for half a dozen lines. Secretan had written the words, dream of death, 3 or 4 times over. He'd begun a fresh word and had scratched it out, and then followed strange, unmeaning characters, the script, as Lewis thought, of a terrible language. And then the writing became clearer than it was at the beginning of the manuscript, and the sentences flowed more easily, as if the cloud on Secretan's mind had lifted for a while. There was a fresh start, as it were, and the writer began again, in ordinary letter form. Dear Lewis, I hope you will excuse all this confusion and wandering. I intended to begin a proper letter to you, and now I find all that stuff that you've been reading, if this ever gets into your hands. I have not the energy even to tear it up. If you read it, you will know to what a sad pass I'd come when it was written. It looks like delirium, or a bad dream, and even now, though my mind seems to have cleared up a good deal, I have to hold myself in tightly to be sure that the experiences of the last days in this awful place are true, real things, not a long nightmare from which I shall wake up presently and find myself in my rooms at Chelsea. I have said of what I'm writing, if it ever gets into your hands, and I'm not at all sure that it ever will. If what is happening here is happening everywhere else, then I suppose the world is coming to an end. I cannot understand it. Even now I can hardly believe it. I know that I dream such wild dreams and walk in such mad fancies that I have to look out and look about me to make sure that I'm not still dreaming. Do you remember that talk we had about 2 months ago when I dined with you? We got on somehow or other to space and time, and I think we agreed that as soon as one tried to reason about space and time, one was landed in a maze of contradictions. You said something to the effect that it was very curious, but this was just like a dream. A man will sometimes wake himself from his crazy dream, he said, by realizing that he is thinking nonsense. And we both wondered whether these contradictions that one can't avoid if one begins to think of time and space may not really be proofs that the whole of life is a dream, and the moon and the stars bits of nightmare. I've often thought over that lately. I kick at the walls as Dr. Johnson kicked at the stone to make sure that the things about me are there. And then that other question gets into my mind. Is the world really coming to an end? The world as we've always known it? And what on earth will this new world be like? I can't imagine it. It's a story like Noah's Ark and the flood. People used to talk about the end of the world and fire, but no one ever thought of anything like this. And then there's another thing that bothers me. Now and then I wonder whether we are not all mad together in this house, in spite of what I see and know, or perhaps I should say, because what I see and know is so impossible. I wonder whether we are not all suffering from a delusion. Perhaps we are our own jailers, and we are really free to go out and live. Perhaps what we think we see is not there at all. I believe I've heard of whole families going mad together, and I may have come under the influence of the house, having lived in it for the last 4 months. I know there have been people who have been kept alive by their keepers, forcing food down their throats because they're quite sure that their throats are closed, so that they feel they are unable to swallow a morsel. I wonder now and then whether we are all like this in Trefloyne. Yet in my heart I feel sure that it is not so. Still, I do not want to leave a madman's letter behind me, and so I will not tell you the full story of what I've seen, or believe I have seen. If I am a sane man, you'll be able to fill in the blanks for yourself from your own knowledge. If I am mad, burn the letter and say nothing about it. Or perhaps, and indeed I'm not quite sure, I may wake up and hear Mary Griffith calling to me in her cheerful sing-song that breakfast will be ready directly in a minute. And I shall enjoy it and walk over to Porth and tell you the queerest, most horrible dream that a man ever had, and ask what I had better take. I think that it was on a Tuesday that we first noticed that there was something queer about, only at the time we didn't know that there was anything really queer in what we noticed. I'd been out since 9 o'clock in the morning trying to paint the marsh, and I found it a very tough job. I came home about 5 or 6 o'clock, and found the family at Trefloyne laughing at old Tiger the sheepdog. He was making short runs from the farmyard to the door of the house, barking with quick, short yelps. Mrs. Griffith and Miss Griffith were standing by the porch, and the dog would go to them, look in their faces, and then run up the farmyard to the gate, and then look back with that eager, yelping bark as if he were waiting for the women to follow him. Then again and again he ran up to them and tugged at their skirts as if he would pull them by main force away from the house. Then the men came home from the fields, and he repeated this performance. The dog was running all up and down the farmyard, in and out of the barn and sheds, yelping, barking, and always with that eager run to the person he addressed, and running away directly, and looking back as if to see whether we were following him. When the house door was shut, and they all sat down to supper, he would give them no peace, till at last they turned him out of doors. And then he sat in the porch, and scratched at the door with his claws, barking all the while. When the daughter brought in my meal, she said, "We can't think what has come to old Tiger, and indeed, he has always been a good dog, too." So the dog barked and yelped and whined and scratched at the door all through the evening. They let him in once, but he seemed to have become quite frantic. He ran up to one member of the family after another. His eyes were bloodshot and his mouth was foaming, and he tore at their clothes till they drove him out again into the darkness. Then he broke into a long, lamentable howl of anguish, and we heard no more of him. Part 13, The Last Words of Mr. Secretan. I slept ill that night. I woke again and again from uneasy dreams, and I seemed in my sleep to hear strange calls and noises, and a sound of murmurs and beatings on the door. There were deep, hollow voices, too, that echoed in my sleep, and when I woke, I could hear the autumn wind, mournful on the hills above us. I started up once with a dreadful scream in my ears, but then the house was all still, and I fell again into uneasy sleep. It was soon after dawn when I finally roused myself. The people in the house were talking to each other in high voices, arguing about something that I did not understand. "It's those damned gypsies, I tell you," said old Griffith. "What would they do a thing like that for?" asked Mrs. Griffith. "If it was stealing, now." "It's more likely that John Jenkins has done it out of spite," said the son. "He said that he would remember you when we did catch him poaching." He seemed puzzled and angry, so far as I could make out, but not at all frightened. I got up and began to dress. I don't think I looked out of the window. The glass on my dressing table is high and broad, and the window is small. One would have to poke one's head round the glass to see anything. The voices were still arguing downstairs. I heard the old man say, "Well, here's for a beginning, anyhow." And then the door slammed. A minute later, the old man shouted, I think, to his son, and there was a great noise, which I will not describe more particularly, and a dreadful screaming, and crying inside the house, and a sound of rushing feet. They all cried out at once to each other. I heard the daughter crying, "It's no good, mother. He's dead. Indeed, they've killed him." And Mrs. Griffith screaming to the girl to let her go. And then one of them rushed out of the kitchen and shot the great bolts of oak across the door, just as something beat against it with a thundering crash. I ran downstairs. I found them all in wild confusion, in an agony of grief and horror and amazement. They were like people who'd seen something so awful that they'd gone mad. I went to the window, looking out on the farmyard. I won't tell you all that I saw, but I saw poor old Griffith lying by the pond with blood pouring out of his side. I wanted to go out to him and bring him in, but they told me that he must be stone dead, and such things also, that it was quite plain that anyone who went out of the house would not live more than a moment. We could not believe it, even as we gazed at the body of the dead man, but it was there. I used to wonder sometimes what one would feel like if one saw an apple drop from the tree and shoot up into the air and disappear. I think I know now how one would feel. Even then, we couldn't believe that it would last. We were not seriously afraid for ourselves. We spoke of getting out in an hour or two, before dinner anyhow. It couldn't last, because it was impossible. Indeed, at 12 o'clock, young Griffith said he would go down to the well by the back way and draw another pail of water. I went to the door and stood by it. He'd not gone a dozen yards before they were on him. He ran for his life, and we had all we could do to bar the door in time. And then I began to get frightened. Still, we could not believe in it. Somebody would come along shouting in an hour or two, and it would all melt away and vanish. There could not be any real danger. There was plenty of bacon in the house, and half the weekly baking of loaves, and some beer in the cellar, and a pound or so of tea, and a whole pitcher of water that had been drawn from the well the night before. We could do all right for the day, and in the morning it would have all gone away. But day followed day, and it was still there. I knew Treff Loyne was a lonely place. That was why I had gone there, to have a long rest from all the jangle and rattle and turmoil of London. It makes a man alive and kills him too. I went to Treff Loyne because it was buried in the narrow valley under the ash trees, far away from any track. There was not so much as a footpath that was near it. No one ever came that way. Young Griffith had told me that it was a mile and a half to the nearest house, and the thought of the silent peace and retirement of the farm used to be a delight to me. And now this thought came back without delight, with terror. Griffith thought that a shout might be heard on a still night up away on the Ocht, if a man was listening for it, he added doubtfully. My voice was clearer and stronger than his, and on the second night I said I would go up to my bedroom and call for help through the open window. I waited till it was all dark and still, and looked out through the window before opening it, and when I saw over the ridge of the long barn across the yard what looked like a tree, though I knew there was no tree there. It was a dark mass against the sky with widespread boughs, a tree of thick, dense growth. I wondered what this could be, and I threw open the window, not only because I was going to call for help, but because I wanted to see more clearly what the dark growth over the barn really was. I saw, in the depth of the dark of it, points of fire and colors in light, all glowing and moving, and the air trembled. I stared out into the night, and the dark tree lifted over the roof of the barn and rose up in the air and floated towards me. I did not move till at the last moment, when it was close to the house, and then I saw what it was, and banged the window down only just in time. I had to fight, and I saw the tree was like a burning cloud rise up in the night and sink again and settle over the barn. I told them downstairs of this. They sat with white faces. And Mrs. Griffith said that ancient devils were let loose and had come out of the trees and out of the old hills because of the wickedness that was on the earth. She began to murmur something to herself, something that sounded to me like broken down Latin, and went up to my room again an hour later, but the dark tree swelled over the barn. Another day went by, and at dusk I looked out, but the eyes of fire were watching me. I dared not open the window. And then I thought of another plan. There was the great old fireplace, with the round Flemish chimney going high above the house. If I stood beneath it and shouted, I thought perhaps the sound might be carried better than if I called out of the window. For all I knew, the round chimney might act as a sort of megaphone. Night after night, then, I stood in the hearth and called for help from 9 o'clock to 11. I thought of the lonely place deep in the valley of the ash trees, of the lonely hills and lands about it. I thought of the little cottages far away, and I hoped that my voice might reach to those within them. I thought of the winding lane high on the Alt, and one of the few men that came there of nights. But I hoped that my cry might come to one of them. But we had drunk up the beer, and we would only let ourselves have water by little drops. And on the fourth night, my throat was dry, and I began to feel strange, weak. I knew that all the voice I had in my lungs would hardly reach the length of the field of the farm. It was then we began to dream of wells and fountains and water coming very cold in little drops out of rocky places in the middle of a cool wood. We'd given up all meals. Now and then one would cut a lump from the sides of bacon on the kitchen wall and chew a bit of it. But the saltness was like fire. There was a great shower of rain one night. The girl said that we might open a window and hold out bowls and basins and catch the rain. I spoke of the cloud with burning eyes. She said, "We'll go to the window in the dairy at the back, and one of us can get some water at all events." She stood up with her basin on the stone slab in the dairy and looked out and heard the splashing of the rain falling very fast, and she unfastened the catch of the window and had just opened it gently with one hand for about an inch, and had her basin in the other hand. "And then," said she, "there was something that began to tremble and shudder and shake as it did when we went to the choral festival at St. Tylo's, and the organ played, and there was the cloud and the burning close before me. And then we began to dream, as I say. I woke up in my sitting room one hot afternoon when the sun was shining, and I'd been looking and searching in my dream all through the house, and I'd gone down to the old cellar that wasn't used, the cellar with the pillars and the vaulted room, and with an iron pike in my hand, something said to me that there was water there, and in my dream I went to a heavy stone by the middle pillar and raised it up, and there beneath was a bubbling well of cold, clear water, and I just hollowed my hand to drink it when I woke. I went into the kitchen and told young Griffith. I said I was sure there was water there. He shook his head, but he took up the great kitchen poker, and we went down to the old cellar. I showed him the stone by the pillar, and he raised it up. But there was no well. Do you know, I reminded myself of many people whom I have met in life. I would not be convinced. I was sure that, after all, there was a well there. They had a butcher's cleaver in the kitchen, and I took it down to the old cellar and hacked at the ground with it. The others didn't interfere with me. We were getting past that. We hardly ever spoke to one another. Each one would be wandering about the house, upstairs and downstairs, each one of us, I suppose, bent on his own foolish plan and mad design, but we hardly ever spoke. Years ago, I was an actor for a bit, and I remember how it was on first nights, the actors treading softly up and down the wings by their entrance, their lips moving and muttering over the words of their parts, but without a word for one another. So it was with us. I came upon young Griffith one evening, evidently trying to make a subterranean passage under one of the walls of the house. I knew he was mad, as he knew I was mad when he saw me digging for a well in the cellar. But neither said anything to the other. Now we're past all this. We're too weak. We dream when we are awake, and when we dream we think we wake. Night and day come and go, and we mistake one for another. I hear Griffith murmuring to himself about the stars when the sun is high at noonday. And at midnight I found myself thinking that I walked in bright sunlit meadows beside cold rushing streams that flowed from high rocks. Then at the dawn, figures in black robes, carrying lighted tapers in their hands, pass slowly about, and I hear great rolling organ music that sounds as if some tremendous rite were to begin, and voices crying in an ancient song shrill from the depths of the earth. Only a little while ago I heard a voice which sounded as if it were at my very ears, but rang and echoed and resounded as if it were rolling and reverberated from the vault of some cathedral, chanting in terrible modulations. I heard the words quite clearly. Incipit liber ire Domini Dei nostri. Here beginneth the book of the wrath of the Lord our God. And then the voice sang the word Aleph, prolonging it. It seemed through ages, and a light was extinguished as it began the chapter. In that day, saith the Lord, there shall be a cloud over the land, and in the cloud a burning, and a shape of fire. And out of the cloud shall issue forth my messengers. They shall run all together, they shall not turn aside. This shall be a day of exceeding bitterness, without salvation. And on every high hill, saith the Lord of hosts, I will set my sentinels, and my armies shall encamp in the place of every valley. In the house that is amongst rushes I will execute judgment, and in vain shall they fly for refuge to the munitions of the rocks. In the groves of the woods, in the places where the leaves are as a tent above them, they shall find the sword of the slayer, and they that put their trust in walled cities shall be confounded. Woe unto the armed man, woe unto him that taketh pleasure in the strength of his artillery, for a little thing shall smite him, and by one that hath no might shall he be brought down into the dust. That which is low shall be set on high. I will make the lamb and the young sheep to be as the lion from the swellings of Jordan. They shall not spare, saith the Lord, and the doves shall be as eagles on the hill in Gedi. None shall be found that may abide the onset of their battle. Even now I can hear the voice rolling far away, as if it came from the altar of a great church, and I stood at the door. There are lights very far away in the hollow of a vast darkness, and one by one they are put out. I hear a voice chanting again with that endless modulation that climbs and aspires to the stars and shines there and rushes down to the dark depths of the earth, again to ascend. The word is Zain. Here the manuscript lapsed again, and finally, into utter lamentable confusion. There were scrawled lines wavering across the page, on which Secretan seemed to have been trying to note the unearthly music that swelled in his dying ears. As the scrapes and scratches of ink showed, he had tried hard to begin a new sentence. The pen had dropped at last out of his hand upon the paper, leaving a blot and a smear upon it. Lewis heard the tramp of feet along the passage. They were carrying out the dead to the cart. Part 14. The End of the Terror. Dr. Lewis maintained that we should never begin to understand the real significance of life until we began to study just those aspects of it which we now dismiss and overlook as utterly inexplicable and therefore unimportant. We were discussing a few months ago the awful shadow of the terror which at length had passed away from the land. I had formed my opinion, partly from observation, partly from certain facts which had been communicated to me, and the passwords having been exchanged, I found that Lewis had come by very different ways to the same end. And yet, he said, it is not a true end, or rather, it is like all the ends of human inquiry, it leads one to a great mystery. We must confess that what has happened might have happened at any time in the history of the world. It did not happen till a year ago, as a matter of fact, and therefore we made up our minds that it never could happen, or, one would better say, it was outside the range even of imagination. But this is our way. Most people are quite sure that the Black Death, otherwise the plague, will never invade Europe again. They've made up their complacent minds that it was due to dirt and bad drainage. As a matter of fact, the plague had nothing to do with dirt or with drains, and there's nothing to prevent its ravaging England tomorrow. But if you tell people so, they won't believe you. They won't believe in anything that isn't there at the particular moment when you are talking to them. As with the plague, so with the terror. We could not believe that such a thing could ever happen. Remnant said truly enough that whatever it was outside theory, outside our theory. Flatland cannot believe in the cube or the sphere. I agreed with all this. I added that sometimes the world was incapable of seeing, much less believing, that which was before its own eyes. Look, I said, at any 18th century print of a Gothic cathedral, you will find that the trained artistic eye even could not behold in any true sense the building that was before it. I've seen an old print of Peterborough Cathedral that looks as if the artist had drawn it from a clumsy model constructed of bent wire and children's bricks. Exactly, because Gothic was outside the aesthetic theory, and therefore vision of the time. You can't believe what you don't see. Rather, you can't see what you don't believe. It was so during the time of the Terror. All this bears out what Coleridge said as to the necessity of having the idea before the facts could be of any service to one. Of course, he was right. Mere facts without the correlating idea are nothing, and lead to no conclusion. We had plenty of facts, but we could make nothing of them. I went home at the tail of that dreadful procession from Trefloyne in a state of mind very near to madness. I heard one of the soldiers saying to the other, "There's no rat that'll spike a man to the heart, Bill." I don't know why, but I felt that if I heard any more of such talk as that, I should go crazy. It seemed to me that the anchors of reason were parting. I left the party and took the short cut across the fields into Porth. I looked up Davies in the High Street and arranged with him that he should take on any cases that I might have that evening. And then I went home and gave my man his instructions to send people on, and then I shut myself up to think it all out, if I could. You must not suppose that my experiences of that afternoon had afforded me the slightest illumination. Indeed, if it had not been that I had seen poor old Griffith's body lying pierced in his own farmyard, I think I should have been inclined to accept one of Secretan's hints, and to believe that the whole family had fallen a victim to a collective delusion or hallucination, and had shut themselves up and died of thirst through sheer madness. I think that there have been such cases. That's the insanity of inhibition, the belief that you can't do something, which you are really perfectly capable of doing. But I had seen the body of the murdered man and the wound that had killed him. Did the manuscript left by Secretan give me no hint? Well, it seemed to me to make confusion worse confounded. You've seen it. You know that in certain places it is evidently more delirium, the wanderings of a dying man. How was I to separate the facts from the phantasms, lacking the key to the whole enigma? Delirium is often a sort of cloud castle, a sort of magnified and distorted shadow of actualities, but it is a very difficult thing, almost an impossible thing, to reconstruct the real house from the distortions of it, thrown on the clouds of the patient's brain. You see, Secretan, in writing that extraordinary document, almost insisted on the fact that he was not in his proper sense. That for days he had been part asleep, part awake, part delirious. How was one to judge his statement, to separate delirium from fact? In one thing he stood confirmed. You remember he speaks of calling for help up the old chimney of Trefloyne. That did seem to fit in with the tales of a hollow moaning cry that had been heard upon the Alt. So far one could take him as a recorder of actual experiences, and I looked in the old cellars of the farm and found a frantic sort of rabbit hole dug by one of the pillars. Again, he was confirmed. But what was one to make of that story of the chanting voice, and the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and the chapter out of some unknown minor prophet? When one has the key, it is easy enough to sort out the facts, or the hints of facts, from the delusions, but I hadn't the key on that September evening. I was forgetting the tree with lights and fires in it. That, I think, impressed me more than anything, with the feeling that Secretan's story was, in the main, a true story. I had seen a like appearance down there in my own garden. But what was it? Now, I was saying that, paradoxically, it is only by the inexplicable things that life can be explained. We're apt to say, a very odd coincidence, and pass the matter by, as if there were no more to be said, or as if that were the end of it. Well, I believe that the only real path lies through the blind alleys. How do you mean? Well, this is an instance of what I mean. I told you about Merritt, my brother-in-law, and the capsizing of that boat, the Mary Ann. He'd seen, he said, signal lights flashing from one of the farms on the coast, and he was quite certain that the two things were intimately connected as cause and effect. I thought it all nonsense, and I was wondering how I was going to shut him up, when a big moth flew into the room through that window, fluttered about, and succeeded in burning itself alive in the lamp. That gave me my cue. I asked Merritt if he knew why moths made for lamps, or something of this kind. I thought it would be a hint to him that I was sick of his flashlights and his half-baked theories. So it was. He looked sulky and held his tongue. But a few minutes later, I was called out by a man who had found his little boy dead in a field near his cottage about an hour before. The child was so still, they said, that a great moth had settled on his forehead and only fluttered away when they lifted up the body. It was absolutely illogical, but it was this odd coincidence of the moth in my lamp and the moth on the dead boy's forehead that first set me on the track. I can't say that it guided me in any real sense. It was more like a great flare of red paint on a wall. It rang up my attention, if I may say so. It was a sort of shock, like a bang on the big drum. No doubt Merritt was talking great nonsense that evening, so far as his particular instance was. The flashes of light from the farm had nothing to do with the wreck of the boat. But his general principle was sound. When you hear a gun go off and see a man fall, it is idle to talk of a mere coincidence. I think a very interesting book might be written on this question. I would call it A Grammar of Coincidence. But as you will remember from having read my notes on the matter, I was called in about 10 days later to see a man named Craddock, who had been found in a field near his farm, quite dead. This also was at night. His wife found him, and there were some very queer things in her story. She said that the hedge of the field looked as if it were changed. She began to be afraid that she'd lost her way and got into the wrong field. Then she said the hedge was lighted up, as if there were a lot of glowworms in it. And when she peered over the stile, there seemed to be some kind of glimmering upon the ground, and then the glimmering melted away, and she found her husband's body near where this light had been. Now, this man Craddock had been suffocated, just as the little boy Roberts had been suffocated, and as that man in the Midlands, who took a short-cut one night, had been suffocated. Then I remembered that poor Johnny Roberts had called out about something shiny over the stile just before he played truant. Then on my part I had to contribute to the very remarkable sight I witnessed here, as I looked down over the garden, the appearance as of a spreading tree where I knew there was no such tree, and then the shining and burning of lights and moving colors. Like the poor child and Mrs. Craddock, I had seen something shiny, just as some man in Stratfordshire had seen a dark cloud with points of fire in it floating over the trees, and Mrs. Craddock thought that the shape of the trees in the hedge had changed. My mind almost uttered the word that was wanted, but you see the difficulties. This set of circumstances could not, so far as I could see, have any relation with the other circumstances of the terror. How could I connect all this with the bombs and the machine guns of the Midlands, with the armed men who kept watch about the munition shops by day and night? Then there was the long list of people here who had fallen over the cliffs or into the quarry. There were the cases of the men stifled in the slime of the marshes. There was the affair of the family murdered in front of their cottage on the highway. There was the capsized Mary Ann. I could not see any thread that could bring all these incidents together, and they seemed to me to be hopelessly disconnected. I could not make out any relation between the agency that beat out the brains of the Williamses and the agency that overturned the boat. I don't know, but I think it's very likely, if nothing more had happened, that I should have put the whole thing down as an unaccountable series of crimes and accidents which chanced to occur in Meirion in the summer of 1915. Well, of course, that would have been an impossible standpoint in view of certain incidents in Merritt's story. Still, if one is confronted by the insoluble, one lets it go at last. If the mystery is inexplicable, One pretends that there isn't any mystery. That is the justification for what is called free thinking. Then came that extraordinary business of Trefloyne. I couldn't put that on one side. I couldn't pretend that nothing strange or out of the way had happened. There was no getting over it or getting round it. I had seen with my eyes that there was a mystery, and a most horrible mystery. I've forgotten my logic, but one might say that Trefloyne demonstrated the existence of a mystery in the figure of death. I took it all home, as I've told you, and sat down for the evening before it. It appalled me, not only by its horror, but here again by the discrepancy between its terms. Old Griffith, so far as I could judge, had been killed by the thrust of a pike, or perhaps of a sharpened stake. How could one relate this to the burning tree that had floated over the ridge of the barn? It was as if I said to you, here's a man drowned, and here's a man burned alive. Show that each death was caused by the same agency. And the moment that I felt this particular case of Trefloyne, the moment that I left this particular case of Trefloyne and tried to get some light on it from other instances of the terror, I would think of the man in the Midlands who heard the feet of 1,000 men rustling in the wood, and their voices as if dead men sat up in their bones and talked. And then I would say to myself, and how about that boat, overturned in a calm sea? There seemed no end to it, no hope for any solution. It was, I believe, a sudden leap of the mind that liberated me from the tangle. It was quite beyond logic. I went back to that evening when Merritt was boring me with his flashlights, and to the moth in the candle, and to the moth on the forehead of poor Johnny Roberts. There was no sense in it, but I suddenly determined that the child and Joseph Craddock the farmer, and that unnamed Stratfordshire man, all found at night, all asphyxiated, had been choked by vast swarms of moths. I don't pretend even now that this is demonstrated, but I'm sure it's true. Now, suppose you encounter a swarm of these creatures in the dark. Suppose the smaller ones fly up your nostrils. You'll gasp for breath and open your mouth. Then suppose some hundreds of them fly into your mouth, into your gullet, into your windpipe. What will happen to you? You'll be dead in a very short time, choked, asphyxiated. But the moths would be dead too. They'd be found in the bodies. The moths? Do you know, it is extremely difficult to kill a moth with cyanide of potassium. Take a frog, kill it, open its stomach. There you will find its dinner of moths and small beetles, and the dinner will shake itself and walk off cheerily to resume an entirely active existence. No, that is no difficulty. Well, now I came to this. I was shutting out all the other cases, was confining myself to those that came under the one formula. I got to the assumption, or conclusion, whichever you like, that certain people had been asphyxiated by the action of moths. I had accounted for that extraordinary appearance of burning or colored lights that I had witnessed myself when I saw the growth of that strange tree in my garden. That was clearly the cloud with points of fire in it that the Stratfordshire man took for a new and terrible kind of poison gas. That was the shiny something that poor little Johnny Roberts had seen over the stile. That was the glimmering fire that had led Mrs. Craddock to her husband's dead body. That was the assemblage of terrible eyes that had watched over Trefloyne by night. Once on the right track, I understood all this. For coming into this room in the dark, I'd been amazed by the wonderful burning and strange fiery colors of the eyes of a single moth as it crept up the pane of glass outside. Imagine the effect of myriads of such eyes, the movement of these lights and fires in a vast swarm of moths, each insect being in constant motion while it kept its place in the mass. I felt that all this was clear and certain. Then the next step. Of course, we knew nothing really about moths. Rather, we know nothing of moth reality. For all I know, there may be hundreds of books which treat of moths, and nothing but moths, but these are scientific books, and science only deals with surfaces. It has nothing to do with realities. It is impertinent if it attempts to do with realities. To take a very minor matter, we don't even know why the moth desires the flame. But we do know what the moth does not do. It does not gather itself into swarms with the object of destroying human life. But here, by the hypothesis, were cases in which the moth had done this very thing. The moth race had entered, it seemed, into a malignant conspiracy against the human race. It was quite impossible, no doubt. That is to say, it had never happened before. But I could see no escape from this conclusion. These insects, then, were definitely hostile to man. And then I stopped, for I could not see the next step, obvious though it seems to me now. I believe that the soldiers' scraps of talk on the way to Trefloyne and back flung the next plank over the gulf. They had spoken of rat poison, of no rat being able to spike a man through the heart, and then suddenly I saw my way clear. If the moths were infected with hatred of men, and possessed the design and the power of combining against him, why not suppose this hatred, this design, this power shared by other non-human creatures? The secret of the terror might be condensed into a sentence. The animals had revolted against man. Now the puzzle becomes easy enough. One had only to classify. Take the cases of the people who met their deaths by falling over cliffs or over the edges of quarries. We think of sheep as timid creatures who always run away. But suppose sheep don't run away. And after all, in reason, why should they run away? Quarry or no quarry, cliff or no cliff, what would happen to you if 100 sheep ran after you instead of running from you? There would be no help for it. They would have you down and beat you to death or stifle you. Then suppose man, woman, or child near a cliff's edge or a quarry side in a sudden rush of sheep. Clearly there's no help, there's nothing for it but to go over. There can be no doubt that that is what happened in all these cases. And again, you know the country, and you know how a herd of cattle will sometimes pursue people through the fields in a solemn, stolid sort of way. They behave as if they wanted to close in on you. Townspeople sometimes get frightened and scream and run. You or I would take no notice, or at the utmost wave our sticks at the herd, which will stop dead or lumber off. But suppose they don't lumber off. The mildest old cow, remember, is stronger than any man. What could one man or half a dozen men do against half 100 of these beasts, no longer restrained by that mysterious inhibition which has made for ages the strong but humble which has made for ages the strong, the humble slaves of the weak? But if you are botanizing in the marsh, like that poor fellow who was staying at Porth, and 40 or 50 young cattle gradually close round you, and refuse to move when you shout and wave your stick, but get closer and closer instead, and get you into the slime, again, where's your help? If you haven't got an automatic pistol, you must go down and stay down, while the beasts lie quietly on you for 5 minutes. It was a quicker death for poor Griffith of Trefloyne. One of his own beasts gored him to death with one sharp thrust of its horn into his heart. And from that morning those within the house were closely besieged by their own cattle and horses and sheep. And when those unhappy people within opened a window to call for help or to catch a few drops of rainwater to relieve their burning thirst, the cloud waited for them with its myriad eyes of fire. Can you wonder what that Secretan's statement reads in places like Mania? You perceive the horrible position of those people in Trefloyne. Not only did they see death advancing on them, but advancing with incredible steps, as if one were to die not only in nightmare, but by nightmare. But no one in his wildest, most fiery dreams had ever imagined such a fate. I'm not astonished that Secretan at one moment suspected the evidence of his own senses, at another surmised that the world's end had come. And how about the Williamses, who were murdered on the highway near here? The horses were the murderers. The horses that afterwards stampeded the camp below. By some means which is still obscure to me, they lured that family into the road and beat their brains out. Their shod hooves were the instrument of execution. And as for the Mary Ann, the boat that was capsized, I have no doubt that it was overturned by a sudden rush of the porpoises that were gambling about in the waters of Larnac Bay. A porpoise is a heavy beast. 6 of them could easily upset a light rowing boat. The munition works, their enemy was rats. I believe that it has been calculated that in Greater London the number of rats is about equal to the number of human beings. That is, there are about 7 millions of them. The proportions would be about the same in all the great centres of population, and the rat, moreover, is on occasion migratory in its habits. You can understand now that the story of the Semiramis beating about the mouth of the Thames, and at last cast away by Archicon, her only crew dry heaps of bones. The rat is an expert boarder of ships, and so one can understand the tale told by the frightened man who took the path by the wood that led up from the new munitions works. He thought he heard 1,000 men treading softly through the wood and chattering to one another in some horrible tongue. What he did hear was the marshalling of an army of rats, their array before the battle. And conceive the terror of such an attack. Even one rat in a fury is said to be an ugly customer to meet. Conceive, then, the eruption of these terrible swarming myriads rushing upon the helpless, unprepared, astonished workers in the munitions shops. There can be no doubt, I think, that Dr. Lewis was entirely justified in these extraordinary conclusions. As I say, I had arrived at pretty much the same end by different ways, but this rather as to the general situation, while Lewis had made his own particular study of those circumstances of the terror that were within his immediate purview, as a physician in large practice in the southern part of Myrion. Of some of the cases which he reviewed, he had no doubt no immediate or first-hand knowledge, but he judged these instances by their similarity to the facts which had come under his personal notice. He spoke of the affairs of the quarry at Llanfihangel, on the erology of the people who were found dead at the bottom of the cliffs near Porth, and he was no doubt justified in doing so. He told me that, thinking the whole matter over, he was hardly more astonished by the terror in itself than by the strange way in which he had arrived at his conclusions. You know, he said, those certain evidences of animal malevolence which we know of, the bees that stung the child to death, the trusted sheepdogs turning savage, and so forth, well, I got no light whatever from all this. It suggested nothing to me, simply because I had not got that idea which Coleridge rightly holds necessary in all inquiry. Facts, qua facts, as we said, mean nothing, and come to nothing. You do not believe, therefore you cannot see. And then, when the truth at last appeared, it was through the whimsical coincidences, as we call such signs, of the moth in my lamp and the moth on the dead child's forehead. This, I think, is very extraordinary. And there seems to have been one beast that remained faithful, the dog at Trefloyne. That is strange. That remains a mystery. It would not be wise even now to describe too closely the terrible scenes that were to be seen in the munition areas of the North and the Midlands during the black months of the terror. Out of the factories issued at black midnight the shrouded dead in their coffins, and their very kinsfolk did not know how they had come by their deaths. All the towns were full of houses of mourning, were full of dark and terrible rumors. Incredible is the incredible reality. There were things done and suffered that perhaps never will be brought to light. Memories and secret traditions of these things will be whispered in families, delivered from father to son, growing wilder with the passage of the years, but never growing wilder than the truth. It is enough to say the cause of the Allies was for a while in deadly peril. The men at the front called in their extremity for guns and shells. No one told them what was happening in the places where these munitions were made. At first the position was nothing less than desperate. Men in high places were almost ready to cry mercy to the enemy. But after the first panic, measures were taken, such as those described by Merritt in his account of the matter. The workers were armed with special weapons, guards were mounted, machine guns were placed in position, bombs and liquid flame were ready against the obscene hordes of the enemy, and the burning clouds found a fire fiercer than their own. Many deaths occurred among the airmen, but they too were given special guns, arms that scattered shot broadcast, and so drove away the dark flights that threatened the airplanes. And then, in the winter of 1915 to 16, the terror ended, suddenly as it had begun. Once more, a sheep was a frightened beast that ran instinctively from a little child. The cattle were again solemn, stupid creatures, void of harm. The spirit and the convention of malignant design passed out of the hearts of all the animals. The chains that they had cast off for a while were thrown again about them. And finally, there comes the inevitable why. Why did the beasts who had been humbly and patiently subject to man or affrighted by his presence suddenly know their strength and learn how to league together and declare bitter war against their ancient master? It is a most difficult and obscure question. I give what explanation I have to give with very great diffidence and an eminent disposition to be corrected if a clearer light can be found. Some friends of mine, for whose judgment I have very great respect, are inclined to think that there was a certain contagion of hate. They hold that the fury of the whole world at war, the great passion of death that seems driving all humanity to destruction, infected at last those lower creatures, and in place of their native instinct of submission, gave them rage and wrath and ravening. This may be the explanation. I cannot say that it is not so, because I do not profess to understand the workings of the universe. But I confess that the theory strikes me as fanciful. There may be a contagion of hate as there is a contagion of smallpox. I do not know, but I hardly believe it. In my opinion, and it is only an opinion, the source of the great revolt of the beasts is to be sought in a much subtler region of inquiry. I believe that the subjects revolted because the king abdicated. Man has dominated the beasts throughout the ages. The spiritual has reigned over the rational through the peculiar quality and grace of spirituality that men possess. That makes a man to be that which he is. And when he maintained this power and grace, I think it is pretty clear that between him and the animals there was a certain treaty and alliance. There was supremacy on the one hand and submission on the other, but at the same time there was between the two that cordiality which exists between lords and subjects in a well-organized state. I know a socialist who maintains that Chaucer's Canterbury Tales gives a picture of true democracy. I do not know about that. But I see that knight and miller were able to get on quite pleasantly together, just because the knight knew that he was a knight, and the miller knew that he was a miller. If the knight had conscientious objections to his knightly grade, while the miller saw no reason why he should not be a knight, I am sure that their intercourse would have been difficult, unpleasant, and perhaps murderous. So with man, I believe in the strength and truth of tradition. A learned man said to me a few weeks ago, "When I have to choose between the evidence of tradition and the evidence of a document, I always believe the evidence of tradition. Documents may be falsified, and often are falsified. Tradition is never falsified." This is true. And therefore, I think, one may put trust in the vast body of folklore which asserts that there was once a worthy and friendly alliance between man and the beasts. Our popular tale of Dick Whittington and his cat no doubt represents the adaptation of a very ancient legend to a comparatively modern personage. But we may go back into the ages and find the popular tradition asserting that not only are the animals the subjects, but also the friends of man. All that was in virtue of that singular spiritual element in man which the rational animals do not possess. Spiritual does not mean respectable. It does not even mean moral. It does not mean good in the ordinary acceptation of the word. It signifies the royal prerogative of man, differentiating him from the beasts. For long ages, he's been putting off this royal robe. He's been wiping the balm of consecration from his own breast. He's declared again and again that he's not spiritual, but rational. That is, the equal of the beasts over whom he was once sovereign. He has vowed that he's not Orpheus, but Caliban. But the beasts also have within them something which corresponds to the spiritual quality in men. We're content to call it instinct. They perceived that the throne was vacant. Not even friendship was possible between them and the self-deposed monarch. If he were not king, he was a sham, an impostor, a thing to be destroyed. Hence, I think, the terror. They've risen once. They may rise again.